Welcome to the Sports Innovation Podcast, presented by the IUPUI Sports Innovation Institute, located right here in beautiful downtown Indianapolis. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Sherman, a full-time faculty member within the Sport Management program here at IUPUI and a professional sports statistician here in Indianapolis. The Sports Innovation Podcast is designed to highlight innovative practitioners and scholars throughout sport and education to learn new and thought-provoking ways to improve our industry together. Thank you for listening to the Sports Innovation Podcast. Welcome to the Sports Innovation Podcast, presented by the IUPUI Sports Innovation Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Sherman, and joining me here today is Dr. Jamie Johnson, a professor of sport administration in the School of Kinesiology at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, and our director, Dr. David Pierce, a professor of sport management in the School of Health and Human Sciences at IUPUI. Today, these gentlemen are joining me to talk about high school athletics and their research into one of the more innovative approaches to success in the nation, right here in the state of Indiana. Gentlemen, how are you guys today?
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having us.
Doing well. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, I'm glad to hear all of that. I'm enjoying the weather right now, to be completely honest with you. It feels like I'm on the beach. I feel like I'm back in Maui. Right?
That's
with
perfect.
The wind and the trees moving and the cool weather. It's kind of nice. I don't know.
Time for race day.
Getting there. It's going to be hot by then, though. It always is every year, right? Okay, so Dr. Johnson, first, tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and on what subjects your research tends to be focused.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a professor of sport administration at Ball State University. I grew up in Indiana. I grew up in Hagerstown, Indiana, and did my undergrad work where I played baseball at Franklin College. Then I moved to Ball State and eventually got a master's in sports psychology and higher education and focused on sports studies. And through a number of different paths, I've ended up being a professor here in our program, and I ran our master's program for about 11 years. And I tend to do research in two main areas, and that would be high school sports and college sports. I tend to go back and forth, but my passion with research really tends to be what we're going to be talking about today, which is some interscholastic sports and all the little paths that we travel when we think about, policy and fairness and competitive balance. And so that tends to be sort of my wheelhouse, my baby, so to speak. I do a lot in college sport as well. I look at academic trends in college sport and leadership changes, coaching behaviors. So those are the two areas that I mostly dabble in.
It sounds good. It sounds like a academic side. You like the tie to the school and the student athlete perspective, not just the athlete perspective, right? From your research background. Now, Dr. Pierce, give us a little bit about who you are and what your research focus has been over the years.
Yeah, so done a lot of different things. Currently the director, obviously, of the Sports Innovation Institute. Kind of started off in the sales and marketing area, moved more into human-centered design, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, but have worked over the past 10 years since our time when I worked with Jamie at Ball State early in my career on this high school athletics competitive balance and policy approach. So Jamie has certainly, led more of that research and published more in it. But when he told me he was doing this deep dive into 10 years worth of data in the state of Indiana on the tournament success factor, I knew that was a project I wanted to prioritize in the slate.
Yeah, it sounds like something that we should be jumping into, right? And trying to get some data behind what IHSAA changes should be made or could be made, right? So yep, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's a passion Jamie and I have is just, we don't necessarily have a dog in the fight. We don't have a school we're representing. We just think that, data and, data analytics can be used to help inform policymaking. So as opposed to kind of anecdotal or ad hoc approaches, these are things that can be studied and numbers can be put behind. And we want those numbers in front of decision makers when they go to vote for policy change.
So as you just mentioned undertaking a 10-year focus on the tournament success factor, which was published in the Sports Innovation Journal, I might add. It's received some media attention in recent days here in Indianapolis. with Kyle Neddenriep from the Indianapolis Star writing a pretty lengthy piece about it. Now, Jamie, if you don't mind me calling you Jamie, shed some light on this. Well, give us some insight into what the tournament success factor really is, and what was it about that subject that attracted you to dig deeper into it, even years ago?
Yeah, this could be a really long answer, so I'll try to trim it down as much as I can. But the tournament success factor is an innovative policy. And if you back up to look at, if you take the 30,000-foot view of the country, every state has an association, and that association controls what happens in postseason playoffs. So state tournament runs. So every state has, in all their sports, they have a postseason competition where everyone goes to win a state championship. I assume anyone familiar with high school sports would know that. But it's an important place to start, because what happens is every state then has a way that they try to ensure competitive balance. And the first way that they do that is normally through enrollment classifications. So we call them classes. So in Indiana, the smallest class is 1A, and the largest class is 6A for football and 4A for most of the other sports. And so the tournament success factor, which was created in 2012 and worked on before that, is really an innovative policy that targets success. And the idea being that there are just some teams at some places that are having a lot more success than you would anticipate they would have from a representative standpoint. And so the tournament success factor identifies those teams that are having too much success, and then based on a point system, can move them up in classification so that the next 2-year cycle, it's on a 2-year cycle, that they would play in a higher classification. And the point system, it's straightforward. If you win a sectional, it's 1 point, a regional is 2, a semi-state is 3, and a state title is 4. And so if you get 6 or more points in a 2-year cycle, then your team moves up. It's not school, it's team. So you could have a 2A high school that has all their teams in 2A, but had a really successful 2-year run in the sport of whatever. And that specific sport then could be in 3A when the rest of them are at 2A. So the tournament success factor then, it takes those teams that are successful in a 2-year period and it moves them up. And then they watch those teams compete at a higher level for the next 2 years. And there's a point total of whether they stay moved up or whether they move down or whether they move up again. So 6 or more points, they would move up again. Less than 2 points, they would move down. And then anything in between, they would stay there. So it's a really innovative policy because there aren't a lot of states doing that. Most of the states, and this goes back into some of the things that I'm sure we'll get to in some public and private things, but most states start with classifications. So enrollment's the number one thing they do, but they have a variety of other competitive balance policies. And many of those policies revolve around the disproportionate success of private schools. Now, private schools in every state are different. The number of private schools, the way they're organized, they operate differently in every state. In the state of Indiana, you've got about 15% private schools, 85% public schools at any given time. That fluctuates a little bit as schools kind of come in and out. And so what we found in our early study in 2014, which was a couple years after the tournament success factor had started, was that private schools were winning a disproportionate amount of time. So, 15% representation in the state. And I believe it was, somewhere around 40 or 50% of state championships they were winning. I'd have to go back and look at the numbers at that point, but it was a much higher percentage than you would anticipate. And so that really wasn't that big of a surprise because, and this maybe gets back to the front end of your question a little bit more. How did I become interested in studying this and the public and private component of it? And so this would go all the way back to my high school days competing at Hagerstown High School, which if you don't know, it's in East Central Indiana. It's a small 1 to 2A high school, depending on the years that they're classified. And like many high schools in Indiana that are public, you would have years of success and years where you're not so successful. You have some athletes come through that are pretty good athletes, and then maybe you don't have as much, and so you would see kind of ebbs and flows of success. And inevitably, if you put together a good team at a public high school, particularly a mid to small public high school, you may get lucky and win your conference, and then maybe win your sectional, maybe even win your regional. And eventually, you're probably going to run into a private school team from Indianapolis or Fort Wayne or some other metro area. Not always. I mean, not always. It's not as if private schools are always, but you're probably going to eventually run into one of those teams. And in our situation, and in many rural school situations, you get beat, and it causes parents and students to look around and go, "Oh, that's not fair." Private schools recruit, or private schools have unfair advantages. And I'm certainly not, as an academic, I'm certainly not saying that private schools recruit. There are specific rules against those sort of things, but that's the narrative. And you hear the narrative over and over and over again. And, I'll get back with my high school friends and people that I know from the community, and, sports inevitably come up, and we start talking about private schools, and that narrative starts to come up. Private schools, it's unfair. They have unfair advantages. They recruit. And so, as I went on as an academic, as a professional, and I was contemplating some of the things I was interested in studying, that was one of them. And so when the tournament success factor came to be, and you started to see private schools moving up in classifications more than public schools, it all sort of translated back to my interest and my experiences in high school. Now, this is not me going after private schools. This is not a public school kid going, "Oh, private schools are bad." I just wanted to look at the data and see what was going on so that I could have an informed discussion. When I go back and I see my buddies from high school and we have this conversation, I can say, "Well, here's what the data will tell us," which is kind of a fun conversation in itself. So my interest, that was a long way to get to the point of my interest came from my own personal experiences and sort of dabbling in some of the numbers, and eventually doing a study in 2014 on the tournament success factor, and then now following up with 10 years of data. I thought it was a nice round number at 10 years to say, okay, let's go back and look. Are we still seeing this disproportionate success from private schools? Are we still seeing that they move up at a specific rate? Who's moving up? Why are they moving up? But really, that was a secondary focus of this study. We really, Dr. Pierce and I really wanted to just examine the biggest criticism, which I know you may want to ask about. So I'll leave it there and let you go where you want to go after that.
I was wondering to myself here a moment ago, is he going to answer every question that I have asked in this one statement?
Sorry.
No, it's
perfect. I get rolling and it all kind of sticks together. So,
well, the best part about this, Jamie, is that I can sense your passion. I can feel in the explanation that you gave that this is something you're really into, and I like that. I more than anything, I don't get people that I talk to that are passionate about what they're discussing, and I like that when it does happen, right? So let's get into this, right, before I ask my other questions that have, directions to them. This one, though, is simple. So according to the Star article and what I've read via, previous edits of the research, you studied 107 teams that moved up a class since the tournament success factor was implemented. 93 of them had completed the 2-year classification cycle, being the primary focus. Those 93 are the primary focus. So break that down a little bit. And Dr. Pierce, if you want to jump in here at all, go ahead. But if you can break that down a little bit so that obviously our Star article had some breakdown in it, but give me, some more of what is, I guess, not just the breakdown of it, but what does it mean?
Before we go into the numbers, I think it's important to discuss kind of the title of the article and what it means. And so the title of the publication in the Sport Innovation Journal is "Are We Punishing Success? An Evaluation of the Indiana Tournament Success Factor and Implications for Interscholastic Policy." And the concept of punishing success really was what this is about. And so if you read the anecdotal information or the media releases, the information that's out there about the tournament success factor, one of the biggest criticisms is that it punishes success. And what that means is, so if you know that the tournament success factor is a 2-year cycle, and you know that teams that are most successful, typically teams that are winning semi-states or state titles and getting those 6 points, if you know they're moving up, well, you got to think about how that works and then what happens after that 2-year cycle. So you essentially have, at many places, not all places, but at many places, you have a place like where I grew up. You may have a wave, maybe a couple good classes, or maybe one good class, or maybe an exceptional athlete, maybe a Division I type athlete that comes through the program, provides a team with a tremendous amount of success. Maybe they go win a semi-state or a state or what have you. They get their 6 points. They move up in classification. Well, if you're not at a school where every year you have exceptional athletes, what happens is those teams that move up now, those good athletes have now graduated, and the athletes that are coming behind them, which may be decent athletes, average athlete, but maybe not exceptional athletes, they are now forced to play up for 2 years in a higher classification, and they may not have the talent that they had that moved them up for 2 years. And so the idea is those students that follow a successful class or 2 classes of athletes are being punished for the success of their predecessors. And so that was sort of the anecdotal criticism of the tournament success factor. And based on what we had seen before with the public and private information, with some other data that we had, I'm like, let's just go look at this. Let's see if that's really what's happening. And so that's really where we started. And so, Dr. Pierce, you want to jump in on some of the numbers and what we found?
Yeah, so I mean, I think just to cut to the main result, I think in terms of like the are we punishing success question, ultimately, what we found in the 70 schools that had an opportunity to go through 2 cycles after their promotion, what we found was that 6 in 10 schools, after they were promoted into the new class, they moved back down to their original class, and then they stayed back down in the next cycle. All right. So those would really be the schools that one could make the argument are being punished for the success. That's that scenario that Jamie just laid out there. So again, 6 out of 10. So 60% of our data were people that are schools that went up, or teams that went up and then did not perform at that next level well enough to stay up, moved back down, and then stayed back down. Now, there's also, the other 40% of the schools, they were ones that did well enough to stay at that new classification ranking, or maybe even, moved up again because they won another set of championships or earned enough, 6 or more points. So really then our question then is, okay, the TSF is an innovative policy. It's trying to provide competitive balance and competitive equity. But the way we thought of it as an analogy is like right now it's a very blunt instrument, right? There's this little 2-year window, and then there's going to be this major change that happens. So we thought, okay, 60%, that's a pretty high percentage that one could argue is being punished for their success. So is there a way, are there modifications that could be made to the TSF policy so that it would be more of a surgical instrument? So instead of like a big blunt object, is there a way to fine tune it a little bit more? And so we spent, some of the time in the paper, looking at, how can we, hone in on and identify and really call out those 40% that really should be up, right? Because they have those characteristics, but maybe not blunt punish those 60%. And obviously nothing's going to be perfect, and there's not a single way to go about it. But ultimately, the two approaches that we looked at is, okay, can we go backwards and look at an additional cycle prior to that performance cycle? So is there more of a historical window, essentially, that we could look at? Instead of looking at a 2-year cycle, could we look at a 4-year cycle? Could you look at a 6-year cycle? So can you go back? Is there a historical metric that could be created? And then the other thing we looked at is, okay, currently they say it's 6 points and then you move up. Well, it doesn't have to be 6 points, right? Like, could it be 7 points? Could it be 8 points? We kind of landed on maybe, 7 points could be the trigger that puts you up. And then we also basically we showed statistically on the historical window, there's a significant difference in point accumulation between the schools that move down and stay down and the ones that stay up or move up. So the ones that are moving down and staying down, they're scoring less points, statistically less points in the previous 2-year window than those who are staying up or moving up again. So that justifies in our mind a past historical window look.
Yeah, it's not just a 2-year window. Historically, almost every year you see those teams that move up and stay up, which are the teams that this really is designed for. Almost every year, historically, they're scoring more. And so it makes a lot of sense to have that historical trigger rather than just this 2-year, because then you're really getting at the idea that there's something unique about this specific program that is causing them to have a lot more success. And that could be a number of different things. It could be an amazing coach. It could be, in the article we talked about, I live about 3 minutes from the Munciana complex here in Yorktown, and Munciana volleyball is a wonderful club volleyball program that's produced national champions over and over. And there's a culture in Delaware County, which is why you've seen 3 programs in volleyball move up in the tournament success factor. You've seen Yorktown, Westdale, Wapahani. Many of the girls who play on those high school teams start really early in Munciana and move up. And so in the sport of volleyball and those schools around this area where I live, it makes a lot of sense. Yorktown was in the state finals last year at 4A, and they're only a 3A high school. But the fact that they're in the state finals as a 3A high school playing up to 4A, it sort of validates the idea that that's where they should be playing, probably because of this inherent advantage that's sitting right in their backyard, which is the Munciana club program. And so that's a unique example, or it's an example of something that's unique in a community that might justify a program in high school just being better than other programs because they start earlier. They've got this, maybe it's a grassroots type mentality, whatever it might be. There are some of those schools that move up and stay up, and many of them are private. And the argument could be made that private schools have inherent advantages with the way they can select students. Now, there are restrictions. Private schools cannot recruit athletically and shouldn't be making decisions necessarily athletically. But athletes find their way to these schools. Whether it's, they all play in a club together and they all decide they're going to go, whatever it may be. Maybe it's just, college prep. And what parents want for their kids when they're done. There's a variety of ways to look at private schools, but you do see the more private schools have success relative to their representation in the state. And so whether it's something like a club sport, whether it's, great coaching, whether it's, urban sprawl, which, we've seen that in Indiana and Indianapolis. You've seen that with, as 20 years ago, schools like Ben Davis and Lawrence North and, those schools that are sort of in the circle of 465 had more success than they're having now. And now what you're seeing are those Westfields and Carmels and New Palestine. Those are the schools now that are growing and having more success because people are being pushed out to the suburbs a little bit. And that's normal. That happens in most cities. So a variety of reasons as to why teams could move up or move down. But the point is, it's not as if this policy is punishing everyone that's moving up. We're not saying that. There's certainly programs that are justified to move up and probably stay up based on their success.
So,
Jamie, can you talk about you've looked at the national, you published a paper that was a national landscape analysis of all 50 states and what they're doing for competitive balance. And so there's multipliers, there's enrollment reducers, there's separate playoffs, separate championships. But one of the problems that states can get into in setting up, something like a separate playoff system is the private schools will sue the association and say, essentially that's not fair. So in our data set, I guess we found that 57% of the teams that move up are private schools, but it's doing it in a way that then it's legally more palatable because it's that the policy is treating everyone the same. So from a legal strategy perspective, you are eliminating the law. It's a risk management strategy in some ways, right? You're eliminating the potential for a lawsuit by just carving out something totally separate for private schools and saying, well, you can't play with the public schools, right? But then it's also bumping up the 57% of the cases of bump ups are from private schools. So it's from a legal perspective, you could look at it from a legal angle and see that there's some benefits in terms of how the policy is applied equally across the different types of schools.
Hey listeners, just a quick time out and we'll get right back to today's episode. The Sports Innovation Journal is currently accepting submissions. If you're seeking a place to publish your innovative ideas and research on the sport industry, then consider submitting your work to the Sports Innovation Journal. The Sports Innovation Journal is an open access journal targeting the practitioners seeking answers to the most common questions and problems in the industry. We're always looking for submissions from researchers who are identifying and studying those questions and problems. If you're interested in publishing your work in or serving as a reviewer for the Sports Innovation Journal, please visit the link in the notes or contact Dr. David Pierce, the editor of the SIJ and director of the IUPUI Sports Innovation Institute at dpierce3@iupui.edu. That's DPIERCE3@iupui.edu. Now let's get back to today's episode of the Sports Innovation Podcast. So,
Right.
hold on. My question, branching off of this a little bit, is there anything that another state is doing that is on par with what the IHSAA has implemented and what Indiana does? Or is it, you brought up multipliers, you brought up the separate playoff systems. It doesn't sound to me as if those two things are as, what's the word I'm looking for? They don't reach as far. They don't have the depth that it's something like a 2-year cycle has. Is there anything that anyone's doing other than Indiana that seems to be on par with what the IHSA has done?
Yeah, that's a good question. Back in 2015, we did this national study of what every state was doing. Now, you got to remember, almost every year, states are evolving, changing, tweaking policies. And so I just collected data. Actually, my student, my graduate assistant, just collected data. I'm in the process of looking to see what has changed in the last 7-8 years from when we originally did that. I don't have the data done, but to answer your question, yes. Multipliers, multipliers and separate playoffs, those two things specifically target private schools. So many states have the issue with private schools where they win disproportionate, amount. So as Dave said, we saw, 50-something percent?
57%, yeah.
57 that moved up, and you only got 15% of schools in Indiana that are private. So that tells you if you've only got 15% of schools that are private, but 57% of the ones that are having the most success are private, something's going on there. And so you see multipliers, which are essentially a number that multiplies enrollment. So Illinois has a multiplier. There's a few other states that have a multiplier. And essentially, they just multiply a private school enrollment by a number. And then whatever that comes out to, they slot them in their classifications based on that multiplier. Sometimes it moves them up. Sometimes it doesn't. Separate playoffs. Indiana has voted on separate playoffs several times. I don't know the exact number, and every time it gets defeated. And a lot of that has to do with what Dr. Pierce was talking about, the legal ramifications, as well as, you'd have competition for sites, you'd have competition for officials, and you don't really have that many private schools in Indiana to really make a tournament out of it. And so in Indiana, it doesn't really work. But, in states like Texas, where they have their own private school association, it can work because you have enough. And so those two things target private schools. But there are other things that happen. There are socioeconomic multipliers, and they actually go the reverse way that the success factor does. And so you go and you look at a school, and the school may be not doing well, and you've got, X number, maybe 70-80% of kids on free and reduced lunch. And so they use that metric of free and reduced lunch to maybe
reduce it.
To reduce it. Yeah. And so it's like a reverse multiplier where, if you've got, for lack of a better term, you've got a poorer school, a less affluent school, and you're not going to have the facilities, you're not going to have the interest, you're not going to have the infrastructure that you may have in a very wealthy public or private school. So there's a reducer that may take them down a class. Those are the big ones. There's some other unique things. Sometimes they'll take a multiplier and a success factor and sort of combine them. But I think, to kind of get to your point, the trajectory of where competitive balance is going is this. It's the success factor for the reasons we just talked about. It doesn't target private schools. It just targets success for whatever the reason may be, whether it's private school, coach, whatever it may be. It's targeting success, which is why we like the policy. I like the tournament success factor. It's innovative. It's forward thinking. And it really comes down to the idea of if you're really that good year in and year out, and there's something causing you to be that good, then sure, you should probably play up and play people that are relatively equal to where you're at. So
Jamie, have you looked at that new data set? Like how many states are adopting some sort of tournament success factor? I know there were 2 a couple of years ago, but I don't know where it stands now.
I haven't. It's sitting in an Excel database that I've got to get to.
That's the next podcast then. Let's go.
There you go. My student told me that as he was going through the legislation and the policies are definitely trending in that direction, definitely trending towards success factors or some combination of success factors. Which
I think makes this research, it's important for Indiana, but if it's, going that direction nationally, people need to know, what the impacts are, from just a pure, here's what happened perspective.
So what I'm gathering from this, and I had a couple of questions that were answered there. One, it sounds to me as if you're saying, even though there's only 15% of high schools in Indiana that are private, you're saying that the 57% of them that moved up, you're still saying that that's a disproportionate number. Is that what I'm getting here? Okay.
Right. So that's a significant chi-square test or correlation, right? Like
so
you can run that a couple different ways and it's going to be pretty significant.
So yes, it's going to show that, but my question is the debate warranted, that public versus private and fairness, right? Is there a debate there to be discussed, or is it just something that people are saying it's just not fair because it's not fair? Or are they justified in saying that it is a problem?
Well, I think the tournament success factor came about because it was a problem in Indiana.
But it sounds to me, though, Jamie, like it still is.
It is, but what you got to remember is it's gotten better because over the years with the tournament success factor, those private programs that have moved up are moving up to the point to where they're competing with schools that are relatively equivalent to them.
So are they staying out of that data that you found of that 57% of the 15? are they staying where they end up getting promoted to via the TSF? Are they the group in your data set that are actually going up and staying up and doing it for a longer period of time? Or is it still that where it sounds like it's penalizing the student athlete when they go up, stay up a couple of years, then all of a sudden the private school even has a down class, and then they drop, right?
That's a great question. And actually, Jeff, I believe the answer to that is yes, but I don't have any number sitting in front of me that parses that out.
So there's still really,
I'll get back to you on that.
There's still really no justification for the argument, is what I'm saying, for the debate, right? The public versus private. Yes, the numbers show, raw numbers show that they're going up at a disproportionate number. However, they may not be staying. We don't know, right? So that's kind of where I'm trying to decide, is that debate warranted still, or is it, you know what I'm saying? You did 4 years and now you've done 10 years of research on this. Are they staying where they end up getting promoted to? And is that where they're supposed to be? Because you know, as well as I do, a 2A school that goes up to 3A goes up and then all of a sudden, bam, they're back in 2A, right? Or a 1A up to 2A, etc. You're not going to see schools go from 4A to 5A to 6A, and then all of a sudden they're going to hover at 6A. Right?
You do actually see that, and you see it in a specific sport, and that sport is football.
Right.
Football.
And that's the only one that it's happening in. And I'm looking at, because that only has 6A, right? But the rest of them, what I was trying to get at was, is that debate still viable? And it sounds like it is pending. Does that make sense? When I say pending, I say pending because Dave said I'll get back to you, right?
Well, it does.
I mean, those are essentially the ones that are staying at the class or moving up, those would be predominantly the private schools. I don't have the exact number, but just knowing the data set, I mean, it's only a data set of 117 things. So like, we know the data set inside and out. And I think, the other thing to keep in mind that may mute that a little bit too is, 25 years ago, like, if you lived in whatever Hagerstown, it was really hard to go move to a different community and go to school. And there's a lot more open borders from that perspective too. So I think, public schools, again, maybe it's not supposed to be recruiting and it's not supposed to be for athletic purposes, but it's a lot easier to be a kid that, lives in Carmel and now can go to Westfield. Like, it's a lot easier to do that now. So I think that, the days of that being an argument from the public school side are pretty. Well,
and then you've got the lines like HSE and Fishers, the one line dividing the two, but yet is there really a line there? It's kind of blurry, So with that said, you guys have talked about a couple of things. You talked about historical perspective. You also talked about point number. So you've talked about tweaking it, and Kyle's article talks about, it could be better with tweaks, right? What are your policy shift recommendations, Jamie? What would be the recommendations that you would make that the IHSAA maybe could hear from the research like this?
Yeah, so in the paper, we make two recommendations. And the first is move the trigger from 6 to 7. And we wrote this because the average point value of moving up and staying up was 6.8. So it was much closer to 7. It also ensures that you win a state title. Now, to some people, that may not be as important, but to some it is. Because originally, the TSF was created from football. And we talked a little bit ago about football, and more teams in football have moved up than any other sport. And there's a ton of private schools that have moved up in football and stay up, the Cathedrals and the Chitards, and, really great schools, really great programs. And they're probably at the point where they're at where they should be. So the first would be move it to 7. If you do that, you're going to get a state champion, and you're probably going to get those schools that are a little bit more historically successful. At least that's what our data tells us. The second is use a historical trigger. Now, we have statistical evidence that say, 6 years, 8 years, how a team does that far back does predict how they would do after they move up. And so you got to start thinking practically, how would you do that? Because if you start going too far back, then coaches change and schools change and facilities change. A lot of things change. And so, where's the sweet spot of a historical trigger? I think it's 6 years. I think you need to move beyond 4 years, because what happens if you've got an amazing athlete that comes in even their freshman year? I mean, let's say you've got a 7-foot basketball player that comes in and, at a 1A high school, and they play for 4 years and they win 4 state titles. And, it could happen. It's unlikely, but it could happen. And so I think you need to move beyond 4 years. So for me, I would say 6 years. But practically speaking, I don't think you could go beyond 6 years. It may be more practical to do a 4 or 6 year window. So those are really the two things.
6 year window sounds like the college model with APR and things like that. That 6 year, it sounds like the model to go off of.
And when you get into the weeds of this, it gets real complicated real quick. Jamie and I have run through different what if scenarios. We don't need to do that here on this podcast, but it gets challenging. For example, there may need to be a carve out though for just straight up back-to-back state championships, right? So it could be in the 2 year window. We're going to look at the 4 year window or 6 year window, but if it's literally 2 state championships, maybe that's, athletic directors and the people that vote on these things, they may perceive that as, too much success to hold off on. So there's a whole there's an intersect there. These things work together, right? The window and the new point total could be worked together in tandem to again, overall goal, be fair, and just make it a little more surgical to make sure we're really capturing in the net the ones that have been historically successful and will continue to be. And our data shows that you can draw that connection between past success and future success.
Right, because what you don't want to have happen is the criticism that these kids for 2 years are being punished for their predecessor success. And if you have these two different triggers, one where it's a 7 point instead of 6, now you're eliminating, a lot of those teams that are being punished for success. And then you go to a second trigger, which is, okay, let's say 6 years prior, how much success do they have? When you combine those two things, you're really going to take out most of the schools that are being punished for success. The ones that shouldn't be moved up, the ones that are the flash in the pan, the 1 or 2 great, classes of athletes, those are the ones you're going to eliminate when you do those two things. It's not going to get them all. It's not going to get them all. It's not going to be perfect, but it will be we believe it would be a better policy if those things were implemented.
And ultimately, the problem you get into and all of this stuff at the end of the day is the folks that are voting, on this a lot of times have it's their lens of their school and what's going to advantage or disadvantage their school. And so that's where we're hopeful that just some agnostic data distribution and analysis can at least help inform that decision making and take it out of the, very myopic bucket of me and my school type voting.
So kind of wrapping up. In the Star article, you've done it here a bunch of times. You've mentioned that this is an innovative policy. What makes this particular policy? You've brought up several. You brought up multipliers. You've brought up TSF. You've brought up other things. What about this particular policy makes it innovative in interscholastic sports?
It's the idea that you're not targeting anything other than the athletic performance. You're not multiplying because they're a private school. You're not looking at free and reduced lunches. You're not doing separate playoffs because of the way that the school. You're literally talking about the competitive balance of the athletic team, not even the school, the team itself. And so it really kind of drills down to that idea of, should that team play with other schools that are in similar enrollments than them, or is there something else that is causing them to be more successful than they, I don't know if should be is the correct term, but are likely to be in that classification. And that's innovative. It's just something that historically we've never seen. Even when Indiana way back had, one class in basketball, the idea that you had to go to class sports was something that was fought. It was fought really hard against. It was hard to get to that. And now, some of the students in my classes will have this conversation. We'll have this conversation of it's really a dichotomy. This is maybe going down a rabbit hole, but I'll go back and I'll talk to guys my age. Guys in their late 40s and even older than that. And there's certainly a segment of this population in Indiana, and I'm sure you both talk to people that want to go back to single class basketball, and who are those people? Well, it's the people who grew up with it. It's the people that, the older people in the state that have the nostalgia that really love the idea that anybody could come in and there could be a Milan. Well, obviously at some point we realized through the evolution of sport that's just unlikely. You're not going to have another Milan, the way that sports have evolved and the number of schools and the way we train athletes and so on and so forth. There really needs to be some opportunity there for classifications. Now, every state has gone to classification systems. Actually, Kentucky may still do basketball single class. I don't know if they moved or not. As of like 5 years ago, they were still single class. But anyway, and so the idea here is that you have these classification in sports and we're never going back. So I talk to my older friends that want to go back, but I go into my classroom and I talk to 21-year-old students and they all tell me, I bring it up, I'm like, should we go back to class basketball? And 100%, no way. No, you can't do that, because they understand that the classifications do something. They make it competitively balanced, relatively competitively balanced. I mean, you're never going to be perfect. And so what this does then is it takes that concept of being balanced competitively, that having people in a peer group that is relatively even to you, it takes that concept and it makes it even better. So I think it works.
And it seems to be the only policy that is relying on success on the field, as opposed to something else, socioeconomic status or
Yep.
enrollment bumpers or whatever. It sounds like it's the one that says you win, you're in, you don't, you're not, sort of thing. So I never really thought of that as being innovative. And the way you guys have framed it, that is definitely innovative. I mean, that is definitely a new way of looking at it. I grew up in a class system in New York State, but we could never have competed with some of the city schools in New York City. There was no way. I mean, no, no. Our basketball team was 10 guys, and that was 1/5 of the school, But the whole thought on it is that innovation in of itself is, I like the way that you framed that. So with that said, I'm going to conclude things, but I want to do one thing before we go. So when it comes down to it, you both are professors in the sport industry, whether it be administration, management, however we want to frame it. Is there something that you want to tell people about our industry? Not on this topic, right? But something about our industry. What do you want to tell people, right, about sport? I don't know. I'll start with you, Jamie. I know this is off the cuff, but I want to ask.
It is off the cuff, but I appreciate that, because I think it's a question we need to be able to answer as sport professionals and academics and people who teach students to go work in the sport environment. I would say one of the conversations I have with my students frequently is, and a lot of times it's before or after class. It's sort of anecdotal, and a student will come up to me and they may say, my parents are a little bit concerned that I'm majoring in sport administration or sport management rather than business, or, rather than whatever, pick your major. What do I tell them, or how do I validate this? That's kind of the synopsis of the conversation. And so when I talk to them, and this is what I would want people to know, is that the sport industry is enormous. The sport industry is bigger than so many parts of other entertainment industries, the movie industry. I mean, it is an enormous industry with so much opportunity that specialization and knowledge in this area is critical. It's a valid area of study, both economically and functionally. entertainment, education, all of it. It's worthwhile. So I would want to tell people that first and foremost, that it's a thriving industry. And it's also recession proof. You look at certain industries that have gone through recessions. I mean, sport continues to grow through a recession. So that's the first thing I would say, is that as an industry that's sort of struggling to gain, and has struggled over the past couple decades to gain acceptance into some of the mainstream academic professions, just know that it very much is. And this information, and when you think about the number, and specifically you think about the number of students in high school playing high school athletics. I mean, it is, I don't remember the number now, but it's an astronomical. If you go to NFHS website, it's an astronomical number. Think about how important it is to do it right, to have the experience of all these kids, be positive. So those are the things, if I had to sum it up off the cuff.
Dave, how about you?
Wow, there's a lot of different directions we could go, aren't there? I guess I would lean towards, just in, speaking to other sport management faculty members out there doing research. I mean, I think this is a really good example of how to do applied research that makes a difference, can inform policy decisions in the real world, but also be publishable and be rigorous and methodological and still be cited and check all of your boxes for promotion and tenure. So you don't have to sacrifice doing research that matters, just to play the university academic P&T game. So, or promotion and tenure game. So I guess that, a lot of different directions we could go on that, but we'll go there.
Anything that's applied is always good, right?
Yeah.
Well, usually, right? And not necessarily always, but. Well, I want to say thank you to Dr. Johnson and Dr. Pierce for joining me today for the Sports Innovation Podcast. Thanks for discussing your research and providing a little bit of insight into who you are and what you're thinking about. So, with that said, thanks, guys. And you could check out Dr. Johnson and Dr. Pierce's piece in the Sports Innovation Journal by clicking on the link below, and check out all that's happening with sport management and the Sports Innovation Institute at IUPUI with the SII at sii.iupui.edu. Thank you, gentlemen, and you guys have a great rest of your day. You've been listening to the Sports Innovation Podcast presented by the IUPUI Sports Innovation Institute. You can check out the research conducted by the SII, get more information on the Sports Innovation Journal, and check out the research conducted by some of our students and much, much more by going to our website at sii.iupui.edu. Subscribe for the latest episodes, and thank you for listening to the Sports Innovation Podcast.